8 years on from a divisive referendum, Brexit still remains an emotive issue, with some psephologists suggesting its potency for stirring animosities and distrust is as strong as ever. Critics feel their Remain stance was amply justified. Brexiters, who the polls suggest are shrinking, defiant in adversity. I should declare an interest. I voted Remain and feel strongly about the issue. But as a social scientist presenting this We Society podcast, I'm going to set that aside today as we turn to a leading social scientist, Professor Sarah Hall, for a dispassionate assessment of the evidence. And not only on Brexit, but on a range of issues, including the extent of Britain's engagement with China, which aroused controversy. She's the 1931 Chair in Geography and Fellow of St John's College at Cambridge, not to mention a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. Her discipline is economic geography, and she specialises in going out into the field to imbue data with discussions and conversations with those in the thick of the action. Her latest work includes a cool examination at how financial services around the UK have been affected by Brexit, one of the potential casualties. She also serves as Deputy Director of the academic think tank UK in a Changing Europe, funded by UK Research and Innovation, which has earned a reputation for a succession of well-regarded reports. Professor Sarah Hall, welcome to the We Society podcast.
Thank you very much, Will.
A question I ask all our interviewees, I'm going to ask it to you. When you got the fateful phone call saying would you like to do a turn on the podcast, but the We Society podcast, what was your thought at that title?
What attracted me to joining you for this conversation was a sense that I think as researchers, as social scientists, it's really important to try and share a little bit more about what we do beyond the ivory towers of universities, to stimulate public debate if we can, but also to raise awareness amongst kind of policymakers and decision makers about some of the work that goes on in universities, some of the sometimes surprising findings we have, and the ways in which that might be interesting and important.
Now, you're an economic geographer. Listeners will have a pretty good idea of geography, but economic geography as opposed to physical geography, as opposed to other kind of typologies of geography. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so it's a question I get asked quite a lot, usually followed by, are you very good at colouring in and do you know where capital cities are? And neither of which I'm brilliant at.
I'm not going to ask you that.
No, don't. But at the heart of economic geography is really a commitment to understanding how where economic activity takes place makes a difference. It makes a difference to the processes that you're studying. So, the way in which deindustrialisation rolled out across the UK took place in a geographically uneven way that shaped the course of deindustrialisation itself, but also laid the foundations for, the kinds of profound inequality that we see in the UK economy today.
So you would say, for example, you'd point in the early, the late 18th century, for the 19th century, of how Lancashire became the kind of centre, actually, of the world textile and cotton industry, and also the kind of West Riding of Yorkshire, a position it was dominant in for kind of 150 years. But as things have changed, the tides that took it there have rolled back, posing kind of big questions about, what does an industrial like that now do? And some of the kind of towns in both Lancashire and Yorkshire which have not managed to migrate to a different economic base are in trouble. And as you say, a profound cause of inequalities.
Yeah, I think the example I would use is Teesside, which is where I grew up and is really the place that sparked my interest in this area. So in Teesside's industrial history, a really important part of that was the chemical industry. And if you go to the landscape at Teesside, you cannot help but notice that it's physically there. It's there in terms of the kind of sort of deindustrialised, post-industrial landscape. As an economic geographer, then, you're interested in what are the constituent elements that shaped that landscape? What were the policy drivers? What were the regulatory drivers? how did a place like Teesside relate to other parts of the economy? And then when we turn to think more recently about how that economic past is shaping Teesside today and into the future, why is it, for example, that we know in the UK there's a sort of significant migrant flow of graduates from the regions into London? And what does that do for London's economy, for the life chances of those graduates, but also for the economies that they leave behind, essentially?
As matters stand, the scale of the chemical industry in the UK is one of the potential casualties of Brexit, whereas in an important paper that you've just recently completed on the regulation of the insurance industry, there's possibilities of dissociating Britain from the Solvency II system of regulating kind of capital, particularly for insurers, that was introduced in 2016, and where there's real possibilities that actually that industry could grow faster than it would otherwise have done, even while the chemical industry perhaps shrinks.
Yeah, so one of the areas where my work is currently most concentrated, really, is to try and think about what the economic impacts of Brexit have been, and particularly actually around the trade impacts of Brexit. And as you mentioned at the start, this is a really contested issue. It's contested politically. It's also contested academically. I think the summary from the research currently would be that Brexit has negatively impacted the UK economy, although the scale of that is keenly debated. But actually, I think it's really important as a social scientist to kind of get beyond that headline, because I think it's in the weeds of the detail of that the kind of interesting and important things emerge. And here particularly, the UK services sectors seem to be withstanding and responding to Brexit, and indeed the other economic challenges that the UK is currently facing, more strongly than the manufacturing and I would include the chemical industry within that. And there's a whole raft of reasons why that is. But I think perhaps one of the sort of starting points for a conversation about that is the way in which services dominate the UK economy, seem to be dominating the economy more. And particularly when you look to trade, UK services trade is doing particularly well compared to goods trade post-Brexit.
We are the world's number 2 exporter of services, aren't we?
Yeah. The UK has a really long history in services exports. And my own focus is on financial services, and there's very good reasons for that sort of international focus. So the UK financial services sector is really closely tied up with Britain's imperial history, as you've written about. And London was a financial centre for empire initially. So it has this kind of international outlook built into it from the very start. And I think you could argue that that's actually rather different to New York, where the US is a much larger domestic market than the UK, clearly. So the international focus is not as prevalent in the case of New York compared to London. So I think what's interesting is that you've got this long history of internationalisation in UK financial services. And there's many waves to that. One of the questions you get asked quite a lot in the media is London going to lose its crown as a financial centre? And the answer there is partly a Brexit answer, but actually I think just as importantly is thinking about those other international threads. And I think actually it's those other international threads where some of the potential challenges ahead lie quite acutely. So you can see that, if you're a US bank locating in London now, doesn't have the same locational advantage as it did when London was a part of the single market.
Let's just continue that for a little bit, because it's very interesting. I don't know where to start, actually. One of the kind of interesting kind of debates in the city at the moment is whether, and you'll find this from the leading insurance companies in particular, Phoenix is one, and I think Legal & General would echo the refrain, as would Aviva and to a degree M&G. So the 4 biggest insurers are all increasingly concerned that unless they take more care of their home backyard, and you've heard this actually from Julia Hoggart, the CEO of the London Stock Exchange, that actually we need to have a bit of home bias now, because it's hard to be an international financial centre and sustain it, given all the cross-currents in geopolitics in today's world, if you don't have a kind of strong domestic hinterland, which is something which is the city has never kind of taken as seriously. And I've been quite taken aback, actually, by the degree to which that's now not quite common currency, because people kind of don't want to kind of lose the international role of Lloyd's or the international role of shipbroking or the role of London in the commodity markets. Of course, you want all that to run on, but you also want to have a weather eye kind of on the domestic economy in a way that I've been quite struck that is a bit of a departure from the kind of long-standing stance that has been taken in the city that you've pointed to.
When we look historically at London, I think one of its real strengths as a financial centre has been what I've termed its regenerative capacities. So in recent history, almost every time a challenge has been posed, London has essentially innovated its way out of that. So that might have been by looking to new geographical markets, as it did post 2007-8, when it sort of courted Chinese finance very closely in the search to sort of rebuild itself post that crisis. And there's clearly a debate to be had about the politics of that and the politics of the dominance of finance in the UK. And so I think when we think about the situation that we're at now, changing geographical focus to its own domestic market is quite interesting as a sort of counter to that.
Extraordinary. Then you try the Americans with the Eurodollar market, you try the Japanese, you look to Europe, and now you look to your own backyard. That would be good news, I think, for the Midlands and the north of England and the British regions.
And there's real. When you come, one of the things that economic geographers have written a lot about is how is London a sort of city-state apart from the rest of the UK? How does the rest of the UK benefit from having a large financial centre within the jurisdiction? Should the UK be looking to a much more kind of regionalised banking system that Germany has, for example? Is that supporting German manufacturing more effectively?
Where do you come down on that debate? I mean, what does the evidence, what conclusions does the evidence that you've uncovered lead you to?
I mean, I think there is scope for financial services to better support and integrate regional economies into the UK. I mean, I think what's really clear is that the UK has a productivity crisis. And when you look at what that crisis is composed of, a big part of it is lower productivity in so-called second-tier cities compared to its European counterparts. So I think from my reading of the research, the way to address regional inequality, or one of probably the more efficacious ways of addressing it, would be to think about how we drive up productivity in places like Manchester and Birmingham, which seem to be underperforming compared to their peers.
By the way, we should say, I think, just as you develop your argument, I think listeners, services is much bigger than financial services. It's architecture, it's accounting, it's business services, it's aviation services. You can even stretching a point, include some parts of the creative industries in the service sector. It's a huge area. And some parts of orthodox manufacturing, like Rolls-Royce, well, yes, it'll make fantastic jet engines, but the bulk of its turnover is on servicing them over time. The service sector is a huge area. It's not just financial services. I think we should stress that. It reinforces your point that if one's going to have a trade policy, you've got to think of services as a really big beast. It's not just financial services.
Yeah, and actually you've kind of moved to the final point about trade policy. In the latest trade figures, we seem to be seeing a really strong growth in what the Office for National Statistics terms other business services. These are actually outperforming financial services on trade in the UK at the moment. And even within the kind of big category of services, other business services is vast. It's things like consultancy. And this seems to be an area that the UK is doing very well on. And I think we need more research to understand exactly why that is, what the implications of that might be, and what policy might be required to support that sector or shape it in ways that the UK wants to in terms of its future economic growth. I mean, here I think you do see a really interesting confluence between the kind of impacts of COVID and Brexit on the UK economy. It's quite clear, I think, that COVID accelerated remote forms of service delivery that were kind of in their infancy before the pandemic that are now quite widely used. And that does seem to be playing to sort of business services strengths.
Just a brief pause in the conversation to tell you a bit about the Academy of Social Sciences, which is the organisation behind the We Society podcast. The general election may be over, but that's only the beginning for the new government, as it has many pressing challenges to sort out. From education to the economy, every aspect of our society is crying out for fresh ideas and solutions. Social science stands ready to step up to the plate. I'm Will Hutton, the President of the Academy of Social Sciences. We're a national body for academics, practitioners and learned societies in the social sciences. We champion the vital role of social science in our society, from education to government and business. You can find out more about the Academy of Social Sciences work, support us, or read up on our fellows by going to the website acss.org.uk. That's acss.org.uk. Now, back to the conversation. And if we just pull this together a little bit, I mean, a Remainer would argue the geopolitics in 2016 looked much kinder to the Brexit argument than they do now. I mean, there was a possibility of an American trade deal, perhaps. There was a possibility of things going well with India. There was a possibility that China would remain kind of open rather than what's taken place. All those are not true. And then there's now war in Europe and, as you said earlier, trade protection and to a degree a bit of service sector protection has grown. And so the case of being kind of in a block rather than trying kind of a strategic trade policy becomes quite tricky, and particularly in services, given today's geopolitics. And so kind of 8 years on, there may be controlling one's borders, those are good arguments that would still stand for a Brexiter. But the geopolitical argument has weakened, has it not? Or, I don't know what your view is, but and again, I make these grand claims. Is there any evidence to support it?
So the way I think about this in research terms is to think that the world economy that the UK Brexited into is quite profoundly different to the economy that we now find ourselves in. And you kind of worry a bit when you draw attention to sort of a state of perma-crisis or those kinds of terms. But I think
they capture a partial truth. It's a partial truth, isn't it? It does capture that, yeah.
But you look back over this period of 8 years and, there's been a global pandemic, a Russian invasion and war in the Middle East. So I think there are good grounds to say that it's been a pretty unprecedented and geopolitically fraught 8 years. I don't think that would give us grounds to say that Brexit was better or worse or right and wrong, but I do think it's an important context in which the UK now finds itself navigating its future economic plans, just as the trade blocs are. I think on some of the big regulatory issues, there does seem, I think one approach for the UK would be to kind of be a sort of advanced, nimble regulator of choice that kind of pioneered new forms of regulation to new products that needed regulating. And then the UK would be well placed to do that because it would be a smaller regulator and could be very nimble and flexible. And then ideally it would kind of set global regulatory standards in a sort of trickle-down fashion. And I think that has been articulated a little bit around medicine regulation. I think the big challenge, though, is that in some of the areas that are now requiring regulation that weren't really on the table in a big way at Brexit, and here I'm thinking about something like AI, so tech regulation, which we've seen a lot of debate about. I think there are some parallels also with green regulation. there are two big regulatory blocks on either side of the UK, the US and Europe. And I think treading a third way between those could be challenging. And I say that because both AI and green share the fact that they're like genuinely transboundary problems. They're not neatly contained in one jurisdiction. And so on green, for example, if the UK applies a carbon border mechanism, which is different to that of the EU, that will incur additional costs.
I suppose what I'd love to ask you, and you can dodge the question if you like, but if you net out the pros, the cons of where we are 8 years on from Brexit, where do you think are the geographical gainers and where are the geographical kind of losers? I mean, I get the sense from you, and you put me right, that actually some of the more dramatic statements about the cost of Brexit you probably think are overdone, but you're, as an economic geographer, increasingly concerned about what, to use your own phrase, challenges are ahead, which may be more dangerous actually than what we've gone through in the last 8 years. That's kind of how I'm hearing you, but you may put me right if I've misheard you.
No, that's quite reassuring because that means I have spoken some sense during our conversation. I mean, I would definitely say from my own research that kind of worst case scenarios, economically I'm talking about here for Brexit, when we look at financial services, have not happened. There were stories that you'd see kind of 100,000 plus job relocations from London, and the figures are not that. I think the other really interesting point that as an economic geographer I'm sort of committed to is in the academic literature, Brexit was framed as, and I'm quoting, the revenge of places that don't matter. So we know that, some of the really significant leave voting places were deindustrialised communities in the northeast, for example. And what concerns me is that I think the economic experiences of Brexit there have been arguably more negative than in places like London. And I think that is a really big economic and political challenge that we're currently just starting to have conversations with in the UK.
And the London economy, I mean, it's holding, but there are corners of it where surprisingly there's a slight sense that while it's holding, there's a very gentle kind of loss of air in the London economy.
I would describe it as kind of plateauing. You see this very clearly in the employment data. It's not a return to the kind of booms of the 2000s. And I think partly that is the uncertainty more than anything created by Brexit. But also I think the uncertainty that we're now seeing in terms of these international linkages, which I described earlier, in terms of, what is London's response going to be to China in the future in terms of financial services? How is it going to interact with the US? How might that change under a change in US presidency? So I do see it as a sort of plateauing. And as such, I don't think there's any room for complacency in terms of, okay, so worst case scenarios haven't occurred. But what might come next, I think, is still a really open question.
Sarah, thank you so much. It's been a really fascinating conversation. I mean, we've ranged from history, your comments about the chemical industry in Teesside, and my comments about Lancashire and the cotton industry. It was no accident that Imperial Chemical Industries was called Imperial, the shadow of empire over our industrial structure, and where physically it took place and geographically it took place in the UK, and your observations about that. And then your kind of careful analysis of Brexit, that actually some of the worst fears about Brexit have not come true, but then neither have some of the more extravagant claims for Brexit. But overall, would it be fair to say that it's more like it's a kind of slow puncture than anything dramatic, and with worrying geographical challenges ahead as geopolitics kind of has so changed from 2016. Is that a fair way of describing it?
So I think there's quite a few advantages to using that metaphor. One is that it really reminds us that Brexit is a process, not a one-off event. And indeed, what Brexit even was going to be was not clear and had to be negotiated, and that took time. So I think the first point I'd say is that, like a puncture, it takes a while to develop, and it is a process, and the UK is still very much in that process. And again, when you get a puncture, there's those stressful thoughts of, how am I going to get this fixed? Where am I going next? How am I going to get to my next destination? And I think those are important questions for the UK economy at the moment, particularly because of the changing geopolitical environment that the UK finds itself in compared to the point at which it did leave the EU.
Well, as someone who's just had a puncture, I can tell you that your description of how it feels is perfectly correct. Sarah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the We Society podcast. I'm Will Hutton. The episode was produced by Emily Finch and was a whistle-down production for the Academy of Social Sciences. Be sure to subscribe to the We Society on the podcast hosting platform of your choosing, so you can be the first to hear new episodes, and go to acss.org.uk to learn more about the Academy of Social Sciences.